Russia's invasion of Ukraine has endured setback after setback since it began in February 2022. Among the most surprising setbacks has been the level of public infighting between the different leaders involved in the war. Yet, when we peel back the curtain just a little, it all begins to make total sense. In fact, when we piece it all together, we see just how fragmented Russia's invasion force is, and how it exposes risks to the Putin regime inside Russia. There are three individuals we're going to key in on as examples: Yevgeny Prigozhin, Igor Girkin, and Ramzan Kadyrov. All three of these individuals have become key critics of the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense since the start of the war. Prior to the war, each had engaged in some amount of critique of the Kremlin, but by and large all three were loyal to Putin. When the war began, Putin was careful to not declare the war a war. Instead, he called it a special military operation. This has legal limitations on what he can and can't do and who he can and can't send. For instance, Russia's conscript army cannot be sent abroad into a war zone unless when in a state of war. Instead, Russia has had to rely on its contract army for the fighting. There were early cases of Russian conscripts being sent into Ukraine early in the war, and this is still something that may be happening as of the time of recording. Legally, however, and even simply practically, Russia has had to rely on other sources of manpower to wage their invasion. He had to rely on other manpower pools because throughout the war and since the beginning of the war, the Russian military has been outnumbered by Ukraine. Russia had deployed initially somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 troops along the border of Ukraine, with most of these being combat troops. However, by the time the invasion began, Ukraine had already undergone mobilization for a month, and their strength was believed to be around the same number in uniformed personnel, which doesn't include the territorial defense, which ultimately played a crucial role in blunting the first wave. NATO best practice when attacking is to assault with a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, and Russia was attacking with either a 1-to-1 or worse than a 1-to-1 personnel advantage. Simply put, Putin had to seek more manpower from the jump. This is where the three men we've named earlier enter into the picture. Each of them represent access to different manpower pools that Moscow has turned to. With their manpower being used, each has taken opportunities to criticize Russian military leadership, from the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu to General Valery Gerasimov. Their hopes appear to be to gain political influence and carve out a sphere of influence for themselves, with each expressing some form of political desire in the future. At the start of the war, Russia had to make up for the manpower shortfalls by contracting and partnering with forces that these three men either directly lead or have influence with. In the initial push to Kiev, Russia deployed Chechen forces loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov to support Russian contract forces. While these forces aren't believed to have been used in direct action, their presence quickly gained them the title of Instagram soldiers. Despite this moniker, they still suffered heavy casualties, forcing the Chechen units deployed to heavily contested areas like the Hostomel airport to rotate back into Russia to reconstitute strength. This collapse led to a series of public criticisms from Burgosian and Girkin, who we'll talk about soon, as well as Ramzan Kadyrov. Each attacked the Ministry of Defense for the poor planning and logistical support the forces attacking Kiev had. Still, Kadyrov has remained somewhat quiet for stretches of time, specifically when his forces aren't directly involved in the war. When the battle for Bakhmut began to stall, and Prigozhin began to make threats we'll talk about shortly, Kadyrov was ready and willing to commit Chechen troops to the fight once again. While the quality and quantity of these forces is an open question, it still bears monitoring. One of the most vocal critics of the war has been Igor Girkin. Girkin, a Russian army veteran and former FSB officer, played a key role as an organizer of militant groups associated with the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in the War of the Donbass. He is one of the three men who were convicted and sentenced to life in prison for their involvement in the murders of the 298 individuals aboard the Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, which was shot down over eastern Ukraine in 2014. Girkin has remained in the Donbass, maintaining some level of affiliation with the separatist militias. Still has become a vocal critic of the war, but not criticizing against the war, but criticizing about how he believes the Kremlin has underinvested in the war. This theme is true among the most vocal and public Kremlin critics, as the one that protests against the war often suppressed and jailed. Girkin can be viewed as someone associated with the DPR and LNR militias, and someone with at least some amount of influence over these forces, at least until they were formally pulled into the Russian military force structure in the early 2023. Girkin has expressed dissatisfaction with the Kremlin's response to the conflict in Ukraine, calling for a tougher stance from the Russian Ministry of Defense. He's been critical of what he perceives as an insufficient action and strategies in the conflict. He has also mocked the Ministry of Defense announced plans to increase the production of munitions, suggesting that the actions were inadequate given the state of the Ukraine war. Girkin has specifically criticized Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner Group, and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, questioning their effectiveness and labeling them as psychopathic. He has criticized Shoigu for his perceived shortcomings and inefficiencies in the military's approach to the conflict. This theme of criticizing the Ministry of Defense isn't without company, as arguably the most vocal of these three individuals, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has made similar threats. The Wagner Group associated with Prigozhin has been described as a, quote, rival power center to the Russian military and other ministries. Its influence has grown during the war, and it is estimated that the Wagner Group has deployed approximately 50,000 mercenaries. Wagner has become one of the most famous of the Russian private military companies involved in the war, taking a lead in the battle for Bakhmut. This has helped Russia with its manpower problem, as Wagner is able to take the brunt of the casualties and absorb the fighting with their large, recently recruited convict force. However, this has given Prigozhin a platform to vocally criticize the war effort, often pleading for more artillery shells. Prigozhin has criticized the Russian military leadership for their lack of support for his fighters and their failure to hold the lines near Bakhmut. Prigozhin has had conflicts with Russia's top military officials over military tactics. He's accused Russian generals of making mistakes and has threatened to withdraw Wagner from Bakhmut if Russia doesn't supply more ammunition. This threat to withdraw from Bakhmut even included a specific date that Wagner would be out of Bakhmut, as well as the threat to withdraw from Ukraine entirely. This led to a letter being sent to Burgosian stating that he would be branded a traitor if he went through with those threats. All of this became even more intensified when a leak showed that Prigozhin had secretly met with Ukrainian commanders with an offer. If Ukraine withdrew from areas around Bakhmut, Prigozhin would offer Ukraine with information on Russian army positions that Ukraine could use to attack. While the feuding has escalated across the board, Vladimir Putin doesn't have many options to remediate in the near term. This leaves him stuck between a rock and a hard place. This feuding has challenged the ability of the Russian military command to properly orchestrate the war, and that's led to gaps that Ukraine has already exploited in the past, and can increasingly exploit during their next offensive. On the other hand, Putin needs all the personnel he can possibly get. If he escalates the conflict by declaring a war on Ukraine, he would gain the ability to officially deploy conscripts to Ukraine, as well as to gain additional mobilization powers. However, the political cost could outweigh its benefits. If he keeps it as a special military operation, he will have to continue to rely on Wagner, the Chechens, and militias and mercenary groups that make up the difference. Even with the current force structure, Russia is running out of room to maneuver and may be unable to launch an additional offensive without another mobilization. As a consequence, Putin is likely to rely more and more on Prigozhin and Kadyrov, while also relying on his current military leadership in Shoigu and Gerasimov. Ukraine, ready to take advantage of the infighting, is growing more and more capable of exploiting on the battlefield. For Russia to salvage their invasion, they'll have to develop a solution to their infighting problem. However, any solution may have already become impossible. With regards to Prigozhin, the Russian Ministry of Defense has acquiesced to his demands for more shells. However, a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut that forces a Russian retreat and undoes all the land gains that Russia's made in the past several months may intensify animosity past the boiling point. Prigozhin hasn't demonstrated a high level of emotional maturity, to say the least, and the Russian high command may be in the crosshairs, potentially literally. For Girkin, criticism of the Russian government can be tricky business. While he has the backing of his ultra-nationalist political party, he still has been careful not to make direct attacks on Putin, something Prigozhin and Kadyrov have also been careful of. Still, carving out a political sphere of influence for himself may be tricky, especially in the post-war Russia, depending on the sentiment of your average Russian. While he has become a vocal critic during the war, a world where Russia loses to Ukraine may see a less receptive Russia to his beliefs. Finally, for Kadyrov, Putin still maintains a great deal of influence and control. While he's been critical of the Russian high command, he's arguably been the least vocal of these three, often disappearing altogether from public through different points of the war. While Putin can exert control over each of these three individuals, he hasn't been able to prevent them from openly attacking his generals. This has created conditions where Russian forces act disjointed and without a unified purpose in some areas. These conditions, along with the poor quality of the current force, pose serious risks to Putin's ambitions and could even spell danger in the post-war Russia. Like this video if you found it informative, it really helps the channel and I greatly appreciate it. Comment with your thoughts. Until next time.